The torpedo did something no one on board believed was possible. It did not turn toward the screaming decoy. It did not accelerate into the noise like a bullet chasing a flare. It slowed. 300 meters below the surface of the Barents Sea, inside the pressure-tight steel cylinder of a Soviet nuclear submarine, that hesitation was more terrifying than any explosion. Silence in a submarine is never empty. It is thick. It presses inward. The kind of silence that makes men aware of their own breathing, the faint whine of electronics, the distant thrum of coolant pumps fighting the cold. 1988. The boat was deep, running slow. A routine patrol officially. Unofficially, a ritual as old as the Cold War itself. Two invisible predators circling each other in black water, testing doctrines written by men who would never hear a sonar ping in their lives. The captain sat rigid in his chair, one hand wrapped around the railing. He had spent his career mastering a single truth of undersea warfare. Sound is life. If you are quiet, you survive. If you are detected, you run. If they fire, you deceive. This was the promise the Soviet Navy had drilled into him for 2 decades. The promise that justified titanium hulls, double layers of steel, and an entire industry dedicated to making ghosts in the ocean. Transient, the sonar operator said, voice sharp now. High-speed screw, bearing 040. The word hung in the air like frost. An American torpedo. There was no panic, no shouting. This was not chaos. It was procedure. Hard to starboard. Flank speed, the captain ordered. Launch countermeasures. At the stern, compressed air hissed. A cylindrical capsule shot free and vanished into the dark. The decoy came alive instantly. It screamed. To human ears, it was just noise. But to a torpedo, it was a feast. Propeller cavitation, engine harmonics, hull vibration. All carefully engineered to mimic a Soviet submarine at full power. Louder than the real boat. Brighter, more tempting. This was the moment Soviet doctrine promised safety. Somewhere behind them, the torpedo should have turned. It should have locked onto the decoy and chased it into nothing. Seconds passed, then, torpedo is still closing, the operator said, uncertain now. The captain frowned. Confirm decoy status. Decoy active, maximum output. Captain, it's loud. The torpedo slowed again, and then it did something that made no sense at all. It's scanning, the operator whispered. A torpedo does not scan. A torpedo is not curious. It does not hesitate. It does not doubt. For 40 years, underwater combat had followed simple physics. Noise in, violence out. Machines were dumb, predictable, loyal to decibels. The captain felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic water outside the hull. Second decoy, now, he snapped. Emergency dive. Take us under the thermal layer. The submarine groaned as it pitched downward. Another decoy blasted free, adding a second screaming phantom to the water. Now, there were 3 submarines in the ocean. 2 fake, 1 real. This should have been chaos. Instead, the torpedo passed the first decoy, pinged it once, and turned away. It rejected it, the sonar operator said, voice cracking. It knows it's fake. Men stared at one another in silence. Not fear yet. Disbelief. The kind that precedes it. How? Someone whispered. The decoys were perfect. They were designed by the best acousticians in the Soviet Union, built to replicate not just noise, but identity. To a seeker head, they should have been indistinguishable from the real hull. Yet, the torpedo ignored them both. It reacquired the submarine. It's coming for us, the operator said. Direct track. In that moment, something broke that could not be repaired. The captain understood it before anyone else did. This was not malfunction, not luck, not an American operator riding the weapon by wire. This was something new. The torpedo was not hunting sound. It was hunting truth. Brace for impact. The report from that patrol would later sit on a heavy oak table in Leningrad, surrounded by cigarette smoke and porcelain ashtrays. Engineers would argue, admirals would deny. Someone would say the captain must have imagined it, because what he described shattered the foundation of Soviet undersea warfare. Across the fleet, similar stories were emerging, from the Atlantic, from the Pacific. From boats returning shaken, their crews quiet in ways sailors should never be. American torpedoes that slowed down, that searched, that rejected bait. Weapons that behaved less like machines and more like predators. For the Soviet Navy, this was not just a technical problem, it was an existential one. Their submarines were their last true threat. If they could not survive a torpedo engagement, their fleets were just expensive coffins. Somewhere inside the long green tube, the Americans called the Mark 48. Something had changed. The question was no longer how to fool it. The question was how it knew, and the answer, when it came, would be worse than any explosion, because it would reveal that the ocean had never been silent at all. It had been listening, and so had the Americans. The investigation began the way all Soviet investigations did, with denial. In a smoke-choked conference room in Leningrad, senior admirals leaned back in their chairs and stared at the report like it was a poorly written novel. Outside, winter pressed against the windows. Inside, the air smelled of strong tea, old paper, and pride. "A torpedo cannot decide," one of them said flatly. "It follows input, noise in, steering out." The engineer across the table did not argue. He simply slid a second folder forward, another patrol, another encounter, another decoy ignored, different boat, different sea, same behavior. The pattern was forming whether they liked it or not. For 40 years, the Soviet Union had built its undersea doctrine around a single assumption: that the ocean could be tricked, that noise could be weaponized, that if you made something louder and more convincing than yourself, a machine would always take the bait. That assumption had been safe because it had always been true, but the Americans had changed something fundamental. The Mark 48 was not new. It had entered service in the early 1970s, a heavy, fast, brutally reliable weapon. The Soviets knew it well. They knew about its wire guidance, its speed, its range. They had designed entire fleets around surviving it. What they could not explain was its behavior after. The wire should have been cut. Captains reported violent maneuvers, dives, turns, acceleration, that would have snapped any guidance line. Yet the torpedo did not become dumb. It did not chase the loudest thing. It searched, it circled, it came back. Someone suggested the Americans were cheating. Someone else suggested secret operators. Someone quietly suggested the impossible. "What if the torpedo is smarter on its own?" the engineer asked. The room went still. In the late 1980s, that idea bordered on heresy. Computers were large, power-hungry, fragile things. The notion that something with meaningful processing power could fit inside a torpedo nose while surviving acceleration, pressure, and vibration felt like science fiction. But the evidence kept piling up. The next breakthrough did not come from a submarine. It came from a tape. On the far side of the country, in a secure naval lab, technicians were replaying acoustic recordings gathered by Soviet trawlers and listening posts that shadowed American exercises. Old work, routine work. Until someone noticed the difference. "Listen to this," a young analyst said, adjusting the speed. "This is a standard Mark 48 ping from earlier drills. A clean pulse, ping, silence, ping again." Then he swapped the reel. "This is from 3 weeks ago. The sound was wrong, not louder, not stronger, just different. The ping slid in frequency, warbled, chirped. It's not a pulse," the engineer murmured. "It's a sweep." They slowed it down further, isolating the waveform, and suddenly it made sense. Resolution. The old torpedoes didn't see targets. They detected blobs, loud masses in a noisy ocean. That was why decoys worked. They made bigger blobs. But a frequency-modulated sweep was something else entirely. It didn't just say, "something is there." It said, "this is its shape, length, wake, mass distribution." The implications hit like a physical blow. The Soviet acoustic decoy was a 5-meter cylinder. The submarine it was meant to imitate was over 100 meters long. If the torpedo could resolve geometry, then the decoy wasn't camouflage. It was a lie with fingerprints. And once you can identify the lie, you never fall for it again. Still, one question remained. Even if the torpedo could see, how could it know what it was seeing? To classify a target, you need references, templates, memory, you need data. A lot of it. That was when the pattern emerged. A young analyst spread a map across the table. Red circles marked reported encounters. Blue lines marked patrol routes. The clusters overlapped in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "These aren't random," he said quietly. "They coincide with our training areas, our test zones." He looked up, pale. "They're not predicting us," he said. "They're training with us." The room fell silent. For years, the Soviet Navy had believed its bastions were safe, protected waters where submarines could operate beyond American reach. The risk of political escalation alone should have kept U.S. boats out. But the Americans had come anyway. They hadn't come to shoot. They had come to listen, to record, to steal sound. Every decoy launch, every maneuver, every mechanical hiccup and startup transient. All of it captured by silent submarines sitting in the blind spots, their tape recorders running, while Soviet crews believed they were alone. Back in the United States, those sounds were digitized, analyzed, categorized, turned into code. The Mark 48 did not ignore the decoy because it was loud. It ignored it because it recognized it. It had heard that sound before. And once a weapon can recognize your survival tools, your doctrine is already dead. The captain in the Barents Sea never knew any of this. He only knew the feeling, the moment when the ocean stopped behaving the way it always had. The moment when silence no longer meant safety. And as the torpedo closed the final distance, one truth became unavoidable. The Americans were no longer building better submarines. They were building better listeners. The torpedo never struck. That detail would haunt the investigation almost as much as the encounters themselves. In exercise after exercise, the American weapon did something that defied Soviet expectations of violence. It did not ram the hull. It did not explode on contact. Instead, it passed underneath the submarine, close enough for men to feel it in their bones, before detonating in the water below. An explosion without impact, a kill without collision. At first, this was dismissed as coincidence, a fuse malfunction, bad geometry. But when the reports were laid side by side, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Americans were not trying to punch through the hull. They were trying to break the ocean itself. For decades, Soviet submarine design had been built around brute resilience, titanium alloys, double hulls, pressure spheres strong enough to dive deeper than anything the Americans could safely follow. The belief was simple. If you could survive the hit, you could escape into depths where the enemy could not chase. That logic had worked against older torpedoes. The Mark 48 changed the rules. In another smoke-filled room, this one deeper inside a Naval Research Institute, a tired engineer stood before a whiteboard covered in diagrams of shockwave propagation. He drew a crude outline of a submarine, then he marked a red X beneath it. "Here," he said quietly. "This is where the explosion happens." Someone scoffed. "It missed." "No," the engineer replied. "It was programmed to miss. A torpedo detonated beneath a submarine does not need to breach the hull. Water is incompressible. When the explosion forms a gas bubble under the keel, the ocean itself becomes the weapon. The pressure lifts the hull, bends it, snaps it like a spine, forced the wrong way. Titanium does not matter then. Strength does not matter, only geometry. The realization spread through the room with a cold inevitability. Soviet boats had been armored against impact. The Americans had simply stopped aiming for steel. They were aiming for physics. And still, this did not explain everything. Even a perfectly placed explosion required one final thing: precision. To detonate under a moving submarine, at the exact moment and position where the shock wave would do maximum damage, the torpedo had to know where the submarine was. Not approximately, exactly. That precision brought the investigation back to the beginning. Back to the question no one wanted to ask out loud. How much did the Americans really know? The answer arrived disguised as an old rumor: collisions. Officially, they were accidents, navigational errors, two blind giants stumbling into each other in the dark. The Soviets had complained. The Americans had apologized. Everyone had moved on. But the timelines were strange. In 1974, an American submarine collided with a Soviet ballistic missile boat in the White Sea. In 1981, another collision, this time with a Soviet attack submarine. Close calls, scrapes, bumps felt through steel hulls. Too close. Too frequent? A young analyst began tracing those incidents alongside acoustic anomalies recorded in bastion waters. Patterns emerged again. Not random, not reckless, deliberate. "These aren't mistakes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're measurements. To calibrate a magnetic influence fuse, you need to know how the Earth's magnetic field bends around a mass of metal. Steel bends it one way. Titanium bends it another. You cannot simulate that perfectly in a laboratory. You need the real thing." And so, American submarines had done the unthinkable. They had slipped into the blind spots of Soviet boats. Match speed, match depth. Then, with breathtaking nerve, they had passed directly underneath. 10 meters, sometimes less. As they slid beneath the hull, their sensors mapped the magnetic signature of the submarine above them. Its mass, its length, its anomalies. A barcode of steel and titanium written into memory. The Soviet crews had never known. They ate, slept, ran drills. Above them, the ocean remained silent. Below them, the enemy was taking notes. All of that data, acoustic, magnetic, environmental, was fed into American systems ashore, processed, refined, and then placed into the nose of a torpedo. The Mark 48 was no longer just a weapon. It was a library, a collection of stolen signatures, indexed and searchable at 55 knots. If the torpedo saw a decoy, it compared it to memory. If the harmonic resonance was wrong, it rejected it. If the magnetic mass was incomplete, it ignored it. And if it lost the target, it did not panic. It searched intelligently. Box patterns, spirals, passive listening for the absence of sound, the quiet void created by thousands of tons of steel displacing water. Silence, once the ultimate defense, had become a fingerprint. And the final insult came in the form of a wire no thicker than a thread. Even when the torpedo was confused, it was never alone. The guidance wire streamed data back to the firing submarine. Acoustic snapshots, partial images of the battle space. If the weapon hesitated, the larger computers aboard the American boat processed the information and sent corrections back down the line. The torpedo was the fist, the submarine was the brain. And the brain had been watching for years. By the time the Soviet Navy understood what was happening, the Cold War itself was already beginning to crack. The economy was failing. The system was exhausted. But beneath the surface, the war had already been decided. Not by bigger hulls, not by deeper dives, not by louder decoys. It had been decided by who listened longer and who remembered. By the time the final reports reached Moscow, there was nothing left to argue about. The pattern was complete. What had begun as isolated, unnerving encounters had resolved into a single, brutal conclusion. The Soviet Navy had not lost a technological race in steel or propulsion. It had lost an information war it never realized it was fighting. For decades, Soviet secrecy had been treated as armor. Patrol routes classified, bastions guarded, exercises hidden behind layers of operational silence. The belief was absolute. If the enemy could not see you, they could not prepare for you. That belief was wrong. The Americans had not needed to see. They had listened. Every time a Soviet submarine left port, the ocean remembered. Every pump cycle, every propeller blade passing water, every decoy launch meant to save lives. All of it became data, all of it archived, and data does not forget. Inside American laboratories, those sounds were stripped of romance and fear and turned into numbers, patterns, logic, software. The ocean, once chaotic and unknowable, was reduced to a searchable environment. And the Mark 48 was where it all converged, not as magic, not as artificial intelligence, but as ruthless classification. The torpedo did not think, it compared. It compared what it heard to what it already knew, and what it already knew had been stolen from the Soviet Union itself. That was the final humiliation. The decoys had not failed because they were badly designed. They had failed because they had been observed. Their secrets recorded, their birth cries cataloged and fed back into the weapon meant to ignore them. The torpedo that hunted Soviet submarines had been trained in Soviet waters. By the early 1990s, the implications were unavoidable. The Soviet Navy still possessed massive submarines, deep-diving hulls, and powerful reactors. But those strengths belonged to a different era, an era where hardware decided outcomes. Now, outcomes belong to software. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the men who had built its undersea doctrine watched their life's work become obsolete almost overnight. Not destroyed in battle, but bypassed. Outdated by a shift they had not seen coming. The war beneath the waves had never erupted into open conflict. No mushroom clouds, no decisive naval battles. But it had a winner, and that victory came quietly. The Mark 48 never needed to fire in anger. Its greatest success was psychological. The moment Soviet captains realized that hiding was no longer enough, that silence was no longer safety, and that the ocean itself had become transparent. The Cold War did not end with an explosion under the sea. It ended with a realization that the side which learned to listen and to remember would always arrive first, not with louder engines, but with better answers. And in the dark, crushing depths where nations once trusted steel and silence, that was the most devastating weapon of all. And that lesson did not stay underwater. When the Cold War ended, analysts on both sides tried to explain why it had stopped without the catastrophe everyone expected. They pointed to economics, to politics, to leaders aging out of power. But beneath all of that was something quieter, a recognition that the nature of conflict had changed faster than doctrine could follow. The Soviet Navy had built submarines like fortresses, stronger hulls, deeper dives, louder countermeasures. Each generation assumed survival came from adding more metal, more power, more noise in the right direction. The Americans had gone the other way. They stopped trying to overpower the ocean. They learned to understand it. By the time the Soviet command grasped what the Mark 48 truly represented, it was too late to respond. You cannot quickly rebuild a doctrine around data. You cannot rush decades of recordings, classifications, environmental modeling. You cannot undo the fact that your enemy has already memorized you. That was the real defeat. Not that a torpedo could kill a submarine, but that it could recognize one. Today, modern naval warfare still carries that legacy. The weapons are faster now, the processors smaller, the algorithms deeper, but the principle remains unchanged. The decisive edge no longer belongs to the side with the thickest armor. It belongs to the side that understands patterns first. The Cold War beneath the waves was never about explosions. It was about observation, about patience, about waiting long enough for the enemy to reveal who they really were. The Mark 48 did not end the Soviet Navy, but it exposed a truth they could no longer ignore. In the deep ocean, there are no secrets, only recordings. And once someone else owns your sound, they own the fight. This is Orfistaski's Cold War impact. And this was the war you never saw, but that decided everything.